Hey, thanks, Walter. And thanks for your support for the Humanities. I mean, I really think that the Humanities Center substantially alters the environment at Wayne State for people working in the humanities. I think I think almost all of my colleagues at some point or another have benefited from being associated with the Humanities Center. So anyway, thanks, Walter, and it's great to be here, and I look forward to coming back. Okay, my talk is a little bit longer than it should be, but on the other hand, it was written in advance, which is not always the case. So I won't say too much about its context, except so it's part of a longer project that I'm working on about Black Leninism, which is basically a project about Black efforts to represent a Black collectivity to itself, and in particular the moments in African American letters where the figure of Lenin and the idea of the party and the Communist Party, factually, the Communist Party of the USA has been important, crucial, both organizationally and intellectually. And this particular piece was written for a collection on Comintern aesthetics, a sort of global, an effort to kind of reimagine what international modernism looks like if we think about Moscow and the Communist International as a center of gravity for a range of literary projects around the world. So I'll get to this poem, which is up here in a minute, but don't turn the light down too much so my failing eyes can still read my paper. And so, okay. From the beginning of his poetic career, Langston Hughes was deeply engaged with the simultaneously political and poetic problem of representing a Black collectivity and representing it, first of all, to itself, rather than to a white or a general public. As he put it in I Wonder as I Wander, the second volume of his autobiography, I wrote about Negroes and primarily for Negroes. My focus here will be the shape that this project took in the 1920s and 1930s as Hughes moves from a poetics oriented around the blues to writing more explicitly communist propagandistic poetry. What particular forms and modes did Hughes bring to this politically charged poetic project of representing a Black collectivity to itself? In answering this question, I hope to bring together various strands of Hughes's writing and to suggest that Hughes's poetry speaks not only to fundamental questions in African American letters concerning the political import of Black writing, but also to basic questions in the Marxist tradition, central of direct concern also to the Comintern, about the role of representation and aesthetic experience in the creation of a revolutionary class for itself. In so doing, I also hope to make an indirect case for the continuing relevance of Hughes' poetry to the present moment, when the representation of Black lives remains, as we know, a vital political and poetic task, as the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in Ferguson, Baltimore, New York, and elsewhere have dramatized so vividly. When Hughes begins his poetic career with the 1921 publication of The Negro Speaks of Rivers, in The Crisis, which was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, to whom Hughes's poem was dedicated, Du Bois had already made an influential case for the importance for the Black writer of representing a Black collectivity. Indeed, this was one of the chief achievements of The Souls of Black Folk, where the figure of the veil and the concept of double consciousness provided the basis for a theory of Black feeling and experience in the white supremacist United States. In so doing, even though the book was apparently addressed to a white general readership, Du Bois's book of sketches and essays seems to have provided for many African American readers what one critic described as the special, exhilarating feeling any reader gets when an author names things that the reader has felt very deeply but could not articulate. Du Bois articulated African American feelings not only in the sense of putting them into language, but also in the connective sense emphasized by Stuart Hall. He created a constellation of relations, linking the critical historical analysis of social, economic, and political structures with phenomenologically rich personal accounts of the emotional effects of being a Black person in the United States, allowing his readers to recognize their own subjectivities as examples of broader social formations, and thus also to see their commonality with others. In so doing, Du Bois turned the experience of being a problem, his phrase, from a despair-inducing one into a way to feel connected to other persons, indeed to see that one is part of a collectivity that could engage in potentially victorious political struggle. Not only did Du Bois provide a vocabulary that allowed for black folk to be aware of themselves as a group formed by a set of shared structures of feelings and experiences, not skin or blood, but soul, the souls of black folk, he also made a case for the significance of the sorrow songs, what he called the articulate message of the slave to the world, as a collectively composed, performed, and experienced musical form that dwells on loss and disappointment, but that does so in a form which returns insistently to the promise of justice and the righteous overthrow of an oppressive order. Thus, in Souls, if not always later in Du Bois's career, the problem of collective self-representation and collective resistance is presented both as a political problem and an explicitly aesthetic one, and one that's most compellingly addressed by African American music. Furthermore, Du Bois shows that the creation of a collective black consciousness that might lead to collective action is not only a question of reasoned persuasion, but of shifting a collective mood. If the souls of black folk are shaped, as he writes, by a deep disappointment, by a necessary relation to loss, as Du Bois suggests, losses produced by the murderous hostility to black life, but also by the lack of economic and political opportunity, and the social and personal rejections that exclude black persons from putatively common, but in fact whites-only spaces of commerce, sociality, and conviviality. If the souls of black folk are shaped by deep disappointment, then the task of the black writer is to find a way to make those losses a source of collective self-awareness and political striving instead of depression. If all black art must be propaganda so long as Jim Crow is the law of the land, as Du Bois memorably asserted, then the propagandistic task requires compelling recognition from the nation by the way of the art of the black folk, Du Bois's words, so that they will be treated as fully and equally human. But it also involves attuning a black collectivity to its own power as a collective, transforming what might otherwise be individual experiences of resentment and alienation into a common, powerful political determination. This is one of the key continuing effects achieved by the souls of black folk, and it was a project that Hughes energetically embraced. But unlike Du Bois, who in Souls at least is preoccupied, though not by no means exclusively, with the black intellectual and what he calls the advance guard, Hughes aims to address and represent what he calls the low-down folks, the so-called common element. As he remarked in My Adventures as a Social Poet, in explaining why he usually did not write about love, roses, and moonlight, sunsets and snow, unfortunately, having been poor and also colored in Missouri, I was stuck in the mud from the beginning. Try as I might to float off into the clouds, poverty and Jim Crow would grab me by the heels, and right back on earth I would land. Hughes's writing did not rise into some special zone of beauty above the color line, but instead tended to focus on the particular experiences of black poverty. Both poverty and racial oppression, and the links between them, were for Hughes social and political facts and experiences around which he would imagine a common and collective existence, not just in the United States, but globally. How such experiences and such an existence should make it into poetry didn't exactly have a clear model, however. Inasmuch as beauty and lyricism are really related to another world, as Hughes puts it, lyric poetry does not seem especially well suited to the project of representing the experiences of poor, oppressed, exploited, non-white workers around the world. His short poem, Johannesburg Mines, which you can see here, addresses this problem directly. A poem that many of you, I'm sure, know. In the Johannesburg Mines, there are 240,000 native Africans working. What kind of poem would you make out of that? 240,000 natives working in the Johannesburg mines. The poem was published in the leftist literary magazine The Messenger. The cover of the issue is that photograph is there, which was edited by black socialist A. Philip Randolph in 1925. And later in 28, it was published in Du Bois's The Crisis, the monthly journal of the NAACP, whose literary editor was Jesse Fawcett. So the poem begins with a simple descriptive statement. In the Johannesburg mines, there are 240,000 native Africans working. Even before Hughes asks what kind of a poem you would make out of that, we might notice that this first assertion is already an interpretation and a situated one. The reference to native Africans indicates, by way of negation, the presence in Johannesburg of non-natives, since it's precisely the foreign colonial presence that turns the people living somewhere into natives. In its reference to native Africans, the sentence also implicitly connects the colonialism of Africa to the settler colonialism and Native Americans of North America. At the same time as a poem published in the United States in a socialist journal by an African-American poet, it invites a comparison between native African workers in the Johannesburg mines, famous for the gold found there, and black workers in the US who live in a similarly racist society, but who are exiled rather than native Africans. What kind of a common existence might this group of native and non-native diasporic Africans constitute? These first lines also ask us to think about the number 240,000. The specific, if probably not precise, number seems less at home in a poem than in a journalistic or official document about the South African economy, perhaps even in the newspaper of the Communist Party of South Africa, which was formed in 1921. It's the kind of number that might be of interest to the Comintern and to the CPSA, the Communist Party of South Africa, which in 1924, as directly directed by the Comintern from Moscow, began to shift its emphasis from the white workers who had sought to maintain a hierarchical color line in the mines towards black workers, eventually adopting a native republic anti-imperialist position. These 240,000 workers constitute the class, that could make a revolution. And in this sense, the number, the magnitude, is an indication of potential force, akin to this insignificance to the number of troops massing at the border. I mean, there's a whole discussion there to have about like numbers in poetry. And Vladimir Mayakovsky had written this poem, 150 million. Anyway, that's a whole side topic which I'm skirting a little bit here. But the number is also essentially abstract, but which I would invite people's thoughts on. The number is essentially abstract. Its numerals, which do not signify like letters after all, seem oddly inert amidst the enjambed lines promising a lyric voice and poetic figuration. In focusing on the number, Hughes seems to challenge his readers to ask how one could represent or imagine in any concrete or effectively powerful way this multitude of workers. The representational problem Hughes addresses here concerns not only the difficulty of representing 240,000 anything, but also how this particular collectivity, working underground, in mines, out of sight, might be represented and from a distance across the Atlantic Ocean, with any effect, poetic or otherwise. And if this still relatively small number is beyond concrete imagining, the representational problem is further complicated when we think about how this figure of 240,000 workers is itself a metonym of even greater numbers of miners and other African workers, native and exiled, and indeed of the workers of the world, whom Marx and Engels exhorted to unite. So then, when in the center of the poem, Hughes asks what kind of poem you would make out of that, he seems to be asking not only how one represents this collectivity of 240,000 native Africans working, but also how one represents the collectivities produced by transnational imperial racial capitalism itself. Hughes here seems to be offering, that is, a distinct response to what Frederick Jameson argued was a fundamental representational problem of modernism, and one of the chief motives for its formal innovations. That is, the impossibility of representing, from the point of view of life in the metropole, the realities of the colonies, which were the conditions of possibilities of that life world, but which were also constitutively absent from it. These native workers, whose labor brings gold, the very standard of value, out of the earth, are not only foundational to life in London or New York, but to the basic operations of imperial capital as such. Yet they are just as foundationally excluded, erased even from the worlds that this capital animates. It is, for instance, certainly not pictures of South African miners that one finds on banknotes that bear the value their labor has produced. Johannesburg Mines, the poem indicates Hughes's interest in representing the experience of the exploited and oppressed as a constitutively collective experience. His question, what kind of a poem would you make out of that, signals the problem of representing racial imperial capital. I'm sort of reiterating. But it is not only ironically self-negating, although it is also that. It's a real poetic and political problem centering on the question of voice. How can one give these 240,000 workers a voice? Can one give them a voice? How does such a voice come into being? That is, Hughes here seems to be asking, can the subaltern speak? In her influential essay, eponymous essay, Gayatri Spivak, I'll never miss a chance to use the word eponymous, Gayatri Spivak emphasizes the distinction between two senses of representation that can be, and often are, easily conflated. Representation as speaking for, as in politics, and representation as representation, as in art or philosophy. Where we have one word, German has two, vertreten, to represent in the first political sense of a proxy or representative, or a representative in Congress or whatever, and darstellen, to represent in the second aesthetic or topological sense of portrait. Spivak argues that being clear about the complex interaction between these distinct senses of representation is of direct relevance to the question of political organization and revolution, of how a class in itself can become a class for itself. Spivak returns in her essay to the classic formulation of the problem in the 18th Brumaire, where Marx lamented that while a class, in this case the small peasants, may be formed by groups of persons who live in similar conditions, who share a set of economic interests indeed opposed to the interests of other groups from whom they are isolated, these persons may nevertheless have no way of communicating among themselves and representing in the vertreten political sense themselves in the political process. In such cases, as Marx famously remarks, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Spivak draws attention to the ways that the two different senses of represent, while distinct, tend to intertwine. It may thus, for instance, be because the peasants have no way to represent themselves to themselves in the darstellen or aesthetic sense that they cannot come together to speak for themselves in the political arena. Because they don't have a picture of themselves, they may be, as Marx explains, especially susceptible to manipulation, allowing themselves to be spoken for by a political figure who can provide a narrative or image of their interests and promises and promise to provide for them. So Louis Bonaparte's representation, Darstellung of the peasants and their interests, allows him to present himself as their representative. On the one hand, Spivak, following Marx, draws attention to this dangerous moment where the hero or the leader can step into this gap between the class in itself and the class for itself as a representative of the class, thereby, in effect, silencing the class. But at the same time, Spivak also cautions us not to treat the oppressed as if they somehow have an innate capacity to speak for themselves outside of the thickets of representation. There's no avoiding this tangled situation. The fact that the leader figure can and does step in where a collective Darstellung and Vertretung are both absent indicates the need and the potential for a different kind of representational activity. Vladimir Lenin famously addresses this need in What Is to Be Done, 1902, by arguing for the importance of the Revolutionary Party, where political professionals would do the work of representing, in the Darstellen sense, in a party newspaper, first of all, the working class to itself in a way that brings the class into the activities of representation, allowing it to recognize itself as a class with its own capacity for speaking and representing. Might poetry function like a party in this way? In Johannesburg Mines, Hughes seems to ask how it's possible to represent Darstellen, a collective in a poem, without speaking for and thereby replacing or silencing it, but also without presenting it as somehow without need of representation in both the political and the aesthetic senses. The poem certainly makes no effort to speak for the natives working, nor to give a picture of the workers or their experience, an absence that appears to answer the poem's question, what kind of poem would you make out of that? By saying that there's no poem to be made out of that, except for one that is self-ironizing about the very impossibility of making that poem. Yet, if there's no poem that would take the natives working as raw material to be made into a poem, that doesn't mean that a poem might not nonetheless announce to the reader the fact of the existence of this multitude of native Africans working in the mines and ask its readers to think about how and where they're not represented politically and aesthetically. Fittingly, Fittingly, for the dialectical tensions inherent in the project, the poem's central poetic device is a chiastic reversal that may itself give an image of the workers even as it represents the problem of representation itself. In the poem's final 3 lines, the poem splits its first sentence at the center, operating thus at the level of the sentence rather than the line, and reverses the order of the clauses with 3 words subtracted. There are in Africans, as you can see here. This little handmade diagram. The descent into the middle of the poem's chiasmus, where the question about making a poem out of that is posed, is the only moment where the poem comes out of the mines. It's also where the poem's central poetic device is mined, since it is the question at the poem's center that serves as the pivot leading to the reversal of the poem's opening assertion. This reversal, however, is unlike Frederick Douglass's famous chiasmus from the narrative. You've seen how a man was made a slave, you shall see how a slave was made a man. Where the meaning there is changed as the words are reversed. By contrast here, the chiasmus in this poem reverses the order of the clauses in the sentence without changing its meaning. The natives are still working in the mines. The reversal is strictly formal, only aesthetic. The speaker and the reader begin and end in the mines, reproducing for the reader in miniature the repetitive, never-ending nature of the work and the enclosed quality of the situation structuring it. Thus, the chiasmus that is the poem's central poetic device points to a collectivity of black workers and their situation while emphasizing the poem's failure to do anything to change that situation. Yet at the same time, by highlighting an unaccomplished representational reversal, by highlighting what this reversal is not, what's not happening, the poem invokes the promise and possibility of a successful reversal. The poem, that is, may be powerless to reverse the situation of the multitude of workers whose existence it points to from across the Atlantic Ocean, but that powerlessness itself also indicates the power that lies elsewhere, in the workers or the readers themselves, even as it seems to call for a representational mode that could bring the workers to action to change their situation. What is needed, the poem suggests, is not a poem to render the experience of the workers movingly compelling, sympathetic, or worse yet, beautiful, but instead some active form of representation, Darstellung, that would allow the native Africans working to represent their traits in themselves in the political process in their own name. The question Hughes asks here, what kind of poem would you make out of that, remained a constant for him through his career. Indeed, I think this is the sort of fundamental question of Hughes's poetics. He remained alert to the poetic and political complexities of any attempt to represent, to speak of or for a group of oppressed persons, but committed to the project of doing so. How to represent that group constituted by racial and economic oppression so that its members are empowered, so they may themselves speak and act. As Hughes put it in 1935, speaking to black writers, the American Negro writer can reveal to the Negro masses from which we come our potential power to transform the now ugly face of the Southland into a region of peace and plenty. Like the Marxist tradition picked up by Lenin, Hughes sought to represent an exploited collectivity to itself in order to help that collectivity recognize our potential power. Hughes sought to represent in a way that was not just a speaking for, but also a speaking to and a speaking with. And so now I want to say a word about the blues. So Hughes's turn to the blues is one way that he tried to figure out how to represent a black collectivity to itself. In his first volume of poetry, The Weary Blues, 1926, the title poem Speaker sees and hears the blues being sung and cites the weary blues that he hears, and that poem could be said to theorize the blues as a form and as a feeling and its mimetic reception. Even as the poem Speaker, if you remember the poem, imitates the blues singer, as Jahan Ramazani suggests, and appears to become more intimately connected to him as the poem moves on, the difference between the poem Speaker and the blues singer remains. Indeed, the nature of this difference between the poetic speaker and the blues singer and the distance is one of the poem's chief topics, as if Hughes is trying to work out what relation he wants to have to the blues as a poet. But in his second book, Fine Clothes to the Jew, 1927, Hughes eliminates the mediating frame of a speaker encountering the blues singer. Instead, the first 8 and the last 9 poems of the book are themselves written in the manner of the Negro folk songs known as the blues, as Hughes writes in a note on blues that sort of prefaces the volume of poems. These poems follow the strict poetic pattern of the blues, one long line repeated and a third line to rhyme with the first 2. This is Hughes. Sometimes the second line in repetition is slightly changed, and sometimes, but seldom, it is omitted. Even if they didn't immediately appear to be so, these were social poems, Hughes later wrote, in the sense that they were about people's problems, whole groups of people's problems. The blues, Hughes writes, are songs of the poor streets and back alleys of Memphis and Birmingham, Atlanta and Galveston, out of black beaten but unbeatable throats, from the strings of pawnshop guitars and the chords of pianos with no ivory on the keys. For Hughes, the blues spring from the material and bodily reality of being poor and black. They give voice to a knowledge of being abused and mistreated, worn down and weary. His word is beaten. At the same time, the throats the blues are sung from are unbeatable. They possess a formidable strength and determination that is both formed and disclosed by their simultaneous beatenness. The blues are made from the experience of oppression and the resistance to it. Their form captures the feeling that goes with the negation, unbeatable, of being negated or beaten. Hughes' blues poems represent a collective by way of a single voice that stands in for a broader group, obviously. Hughes writes, "The I pictured in many of my blues poems is the poor and uneducated Negro of the South, and not myself who grew up in Kansas." In his use of this I, Hughes expands upon the I in poems such as The Negro Speaks of Rivers, among other early poems, where his I represents a kind of global, diasporic Negro people brought together by and through a long history, figured by the rivers known by the I of that famous first poem. Hughes's admiration for Whitman is well known, and certainly he borrows something of Whitman's I, about which Hughes wrote, one of the greatest I poets of all time. Whitman's I is not the I of the introspective versifiers who write always and only about themselves. Rather, it's the cosmic I of peoples who seek freedom, decency, and dignity, friendship, and equality between individuals and races all over the world. So, although Hughes, I think, is clearly engaged with this Whitmanian poetics, he also seems to be constantly seeking ways to represent and address a black collectivity in ways that test the limits of such an I. If Whitman's is a cosmic I, Hughes's is low down. He seeks to represent the specificity of a group comprised of the black and the poor. But in as much as the lyric I is by definition an active subject, first of all in that it speaks, how can it represent the multiple, related, but distinct experiences of exploitation, which is to say, of being treated as an object? Through his career, I think Hughes is constantly playing with the nature and function of his speaker, trying to find ways to indicate the ways that this I is also necessarily situated, even thrown into various situations, over which her or his agency is limited, situations which must be survived or escaped. How can the poet represent an I that also indicated the plurality of which it is a part, the others that this I is speaking with? The distinct eye of the blues, I think, offers several resources to Hughes in this project, in this poetic project. First of all, even if they're sung alone, the form of the blues brings with it a history of voices. They all stem, Hughes writes, from the old-time, basic, anonymous, 12-bar, 3-line lyric, Deep South blues that nobody knows who made up, nobody knows who added what line where. So in singing the blues, one's voice joins with an anonymous collective of voices by way of the form of the song itself. Moreover, the blues was notably, even scandalously, capacious in terms of its particular experiences, the particular experiences it could give voice to: love, desire, sex, drunkenness, poverty, gambling, suicide, violence. The experience of women speaking openly of sex and desire in particular are central to the blues, as we know. Indeed, when Hughes writes Fine Clothes, the blues is already a form made famous by singers like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. Not infrequently, the blues are related to pleasures and troubles with same-sex objects of love, or with gender nonconformity. As Eric Garber puts it, the blues reflected a culture that accepted sexuality, including homosexual behavior and identities, as a natural part of life. And the blues are themselves multiple. There are, as Hughes notes, many blues: family blues, loveless blues, left lonesome blues, broken hungry blues, and desperate going to the river blues. Middle of the semester blues. The collective composition and multitudinous experiences given voice within the form were met with a broad popular reception. The blues enjoyed a mass audience, and one which crossed the color line and did so transnationally, even as the blues were recognized as a clearly black aesthetic form. So, thus, in writing the blues lyrics, Hughes is appropriating a form that already was engaged in the project of representing a black collectivity to itself and to others. As a form, I think also the blues thematizes itself as a meeting place of the singular and the plural. Sorry for all the, it's like insider trading in Langston Hughes studies, but on the one hand, where the spirituals and the sorrow songs are group songs, the blues are songs that you sing alone. The mood of the blues is almost always despondency. They're about loss, loneliness, weariness, being beaten down. Yet, Hughes writes, when they're sung, people laugh. There's a fundamental disjuncture, that is, or reversal in the music between the mood of the music, what might also be called its tone, the mood that seems to belong to the song as such, on the one hand, and the way that the song produces an effect in its audiences. So in singing about troubles, about being weary and beaten down, the blues at the same time also gives voice to a feeling of unbeatability. Its beat, Hughes writes, is a marching on syncopation. The conversion of feeling, what we might also call, or what I'm inclined to call the awakening of a counter mood, happens at the moment when the blues yokes together, I think, the feeling of depressive loneliness with the sense of sharing this feeling with others like me, as in Hughes's Misery. Black gal like me, has got to hear a blues for her misery. The blues will ease my misery precisely inasmuch as they make that misery shared and shareable through a form that is itself collective and which gives one a common comic distance on it. It's not, I don't think, cathartic laughter so much as an ironizing, long historical perspective, loud-mouthed laughter. A laughter in the hands of fate, one that can see the ridiculousness of the misery, the humor in history's cunning, miserable ruses. The blues is itself a way of being with others, a way of being tuned to others in relation to a given problem. This simultaneously singular and plural way of being with others comes into existence at the moment when one senses that one is part of a vast collective, shared interest in experiences, a shared sense of being both the object and the subject of historical forces. And that sense of collectivity, rather than erasing or flattening out one's own sort of singular, particular experience, allows it to come into being as such. The production of such moments, that sort of joining of the singular and the plural, is, I think, one important poetic ideal for Hughes, kind of center of gravity. Within Fine Clothes to the Jew, the range of blues that Hughes presents itself also produces a plurality. His blues present distinct voices and distinct situations, although feelings of nobody to love me, as in suicide, or of a man having done me wrong, as in misery, may be the most common here. The intensity of love and desire, the painful disappointments that accompany its failures are well represented. The intent to kill oneself or somebody else is also frequently announced. Homesickness, poverty, friendship, and the pleasures and dangers of drunkenness are sung of too. What is Hughes doing in collecting this multitude of black, beaten, but unbeatable voices? Brent Edwards has suggested they're like transcriptions of songs that the poet has heard, who's thereby serving as a kind of recording mechanism, a collector of songs. But at the same time, Hughes has composed a songbook from which we too might sing. In this songbook, Hughes's own promiscuous inhabitation of a series of mostly female, distinct but similarly bluesy voices models a mimetic participation in a poetic collectivity which the reader is invited to join. In this, Hughes's blues lyrics provide for the reader an emphatic coincidence of a singular and a plural mode of feeling. In his invitation to sing with him, to imitate as he has imitated, to inhabit as he has inhabited these multiple voices. So, okay, I'll finish up here talking about this poem, Goodbye Christ. At first look, it might seem that Hughes's explicitly political or propagandistic writing of the 30s marks a sort of radical departure from his earlier work. Certainly much of the poetry looked different typographically, as Hughes experimented with different page layouts and the use of agitational punctuation in capital letters. In addition, a new communist vocabulary is articulated as Hughes refers to workers, peasants, Marxism, the Soviet Union, and the communism as such. Lenin's name appears from time to time. Certainly, Lenin was there as a revolutionary figure who powerfully symbolized the possibility of revolutionary social and political change, which had drawn Hughes, a possibility which Hughes had been powerfully exposed during his 1932-1933 travels in the Soviet Union, and it especially had out the promise of the eradication of Jim Crow. Indeed, inasmuch as Lenin was already a name heard in communist songs heard across the South, as Robin Kelly has noted, Hughes may not have been introducing the name of Lenin so much as boosting its currency. But I think Lenin's name also attracted attention because he addressed basic problems of political organization, which were central to the black radical tradition as well. Chief among these was the question of how to bring together oppressed persons in solidarity as an energetic, hopeful, and demanding collective, which then engages in transformative political action. Lenin, I think, also stood for a tactically canny internationalism, and one that also corresponds to Hughes's political and poetic concerns. And I think I can, something to say about the black belt thesis there. What brings the blues poems together with the communist poems of the 30s is the persistent engagement with the question of how Hughes might compose an aesthetic form that could function like a party, to represent a class of poor black persons to themselves in a way that would reveal, to repeat this passage from Hughes, our potential power to transform the now ugly face of the Southland, the American South. Hughes's preoccupation with this question is evident in Scottsboro Limited, the agitational play that Hughes wrote about the black youths charged with raping 2 white women. The play opens with the 8 black boys chained on stage, engaging in dialogue with a white man in the audience. At one point, the 8th boy, who sort of becomes a sort of hero, says defiantly, "We will be dead if we stay quiet here. That's why we come tonight, to lift our troubles high like a flag against the sky." The play then depicts the Scottsboro boys riding on the train, being unjustly accused, arrested, and tried. It's like an agitational play that sort of reenacts the sort of what happened. At a crucial moment, the 8th boy voices his resistance. And as if offering an explicit rejoinder to Marx's famous comment about the peasants that they can't represent themselves, they must be represented, the boy addresses the prison keeper, who's played by the same white man as the sheriff and the judge, who's just told them to shut up in there. The eighth voice says, instead of being unable to represent or speak for himself and thus needing to be represented, he says, I've got nobody to talk for me, so I'll talk for myself, see. To which the red voices, which are located in the audience, answer, and the red flag too will talk for you. That is, he will speak for himself because nobody's talking for him, and then also the Communist Party, the red flag, will also speak for him. There's no either or represent themselves or be represented situation here. Indeed, it is in speaking for himself that the eighth boy enables the red voices to speak to him and to offer to speak for him and his fellow defendants. But like a flag, interestingly how it's figured, the speaking for doesn't silence or replace, but instead lifts their troubles high so that they can be publicly, collectively seen and heard. Indeed, and this is in fact what happened, indeed in bringing attention to the trial and paying for legal support, the Communist Party USA did amplify and publicize the voices of the Scottsboro defendants. The case powerfully, as you know, focused international attention on the fact that black persons in the US, especially in the South, were not in fact protected, we might say represented by the law. So in representing the eight black boys as a varied collectivity, right, there's sort of eight, they all have separate voices, in contradistinction to the white man, who is the same actor playing the racist audience member, the sheriff, the judge, the prison guard, and the preacher, the embodiment of white supremacy itself. Scottsboro Unlimited also sets the stage for an audience collective to emerge that speaks with the black boys. By joining the red voices around them, right, he sort of plants in the audience a sort of the chorus that speaks up in response, a member of the audience might make an already existing voice louder and more powerful. I think Hughes is trying to achieve a similar kind of amplifying witness in his communist poems of the 30s. There's a number of poems that he does this in, quite a number of very interesting poems. One of them is Goodbye Christ, which was also one of his most controversial. It was published in the Negro Worker in the November-December issue of 1932. This was George Padmore's paper, the Jamaican Communist. It was financed by the Comintern, and it was published out of Hamburg. This is the cover, and it's a sort of it's explicitly international. Later, Hughes explained that the poem was written after a trip through the American South in which the horrors of racism and racial capitalism were on abundant display. How could a supposedly Christian nation allow such inequality and injustice to flourish? This was followed by a trip to the Soviet Union, in which Hughes writes, meager as the resources of the country were, white and black, Asiatic and European, Jew and Gentile, stood alike as citizens on an equal footing, protected from racial inequalities by the law. There were no pogroms, no lynchings, no Jim Crow cars, as there once had been in Tsarist Asia, nor were the newspaper or movies permitted to ridicule or malign any people because of race. I was deeply impressed by these things, Hughes writes. He wrote the poem to expose the hypocrisy of the so-called Christians who allowed and indeed promoted these grossest of inequalities. The poem, as you can see, is directly addressed to Christ. The financial and moral corruption of the church is front and center. Listen, Christ, you did all right in your day, I reckon, but now you've been pawned out till you've done worn out. Goodbye, Christ, Jesus, Lord, God, Jehovah, beat it on away from here, make way for a new guy with no religion at all, a real guy named Marx, communist, Lenin, peasant, Stalin, worker, me. I said me. Who is this me here? What kind of a subject is this new guy who is real with no religion at all? This real guy is named Marx, communist, Lenin, peasant, Stalin, worker, me. While there's a certain communist thematic coherence to the list, these names each point to different kinds of subjects and different kinds of representation. On the one hand, we get the Holy Trinity, the holy sort of Soviet Stalinist trio, Marx, Lenin, Stalin that one could find on posters and other propaganda material in the 30s. Engels sometimes was tossed in there too. And there's an implicit narrative traced out here in sort of Soviet ideology. The arguments made by Marx against capitalism and for communism were put into revolutionary action by Lenin, whose vision of communism is perpetuated in its state form by Stalin. These are the real guys that Christ should make way for. Better to study their readings, their teachings. But then, the paratactical structure of the line, though here its lack of commas suggests that this is not quite a list, but perhaps itself a single long name, suggests that these proper names are on the same level as the generic subjects, communist, peasant, worker, who these three persons represent, both in the Vertreten and in the Darstellen sense. There's a thought here to be had about how it's sort of, he's riffing on this sort of the first one, Christ, Jesus, Lord God, Jehovah as well, similarly paratactical but without comments. Marx, Lenin, and Stalin variously, of course, give a picture of and speak for the communist peasant and worker, each in different ways. Marx could be said to represent in the sense of depicting, theorizing, describing the condition of the worker under capitalism in texts, and any number of texts, and to speak for the worker and the communist in the Communist Manifesto. Lenin, too, in his work in the party, represented the working class to itself, enabling it to come together as a revolutionary collective. The project of representing the worker, the peasant, and the communist, of course, changed dramatically after the revolution and the formation of the Soviet Union, where the task was quite different. It was no longer the creation of a revolutionary class, but the creation of a communist state and a communist society. But in Goodbye Christ, and obviously there's much more to say there, but in Goodbye, about these figures, in Goodbye Christ, the representers and the represented, the speakers and the spoken for, are brought together into one single name. All of them together become me, or rather, me, exclamation point. This new subject, the one with no religion, the communist one, who's not someone else or somewhere else, but it's right here in the space and the now of this poem itself. I take this me to be a collective of me's. It's meaningful to the extent that it's many me's simultaneously. As Hughes explained it, defending the poem and himself years later, he got a hard time for the poem. The I, which I pictured, was the newly liberated peasant of the state collectives I had seen in Russia, merged with those American Negro workers of the Depression period who believed in the Soviet dream and the hope that it held out for a solution to their racial and economic difficulties. But this me is collective not only in a sense that it means to metonymically represent a large international group. The capital letters here also, I think, indicate that this me is meant to be shouted out loud by something like a red chorus of people calling out together. It's a moment when a collective voice and the new subject brought into being by the experience of solidarity enters into the poem. A new way of being with others, a new withness has been awakened. Almost done. Hughes had been making interesting use of capital letters he'd already been messing around with capital letters, such as in this poem, The Cat and the Saxophone, published in the Weary Blues, where the capital letters indicate the intrusion of a different voice. In this case, it's the voice of the song, Everybody Loves My Baby, but my baby don't love nobody with me, but me. That as the turn to all caps here indicates this sort of intrusion of a public, musical, performative voice into the poem. It's another voice. In the 30s, Hughes uses capital letters with some frequency. Go back to this. A standard feature of agitational writing is usually taken to indicate increased volume or group voices. In some poems written in the 30s, including Goodbye Christ, capital letters retain something of the insurgency of the voice entering into the poem from the shared situation, like the music in the cabaret, as if they signify the voice of the situation as itself, as such. In so doing, in Goodbye Christ, the me also seems to offer a reflection on the limits and potential of the poetic voice. It's significant in this regard that the speaker here has become a me, and not an I. Where I, of course, is a subject, grammatically speaking, me is a direct or an indirect object. And me starts to appear in Hughes's poetry with increasing frequency with his blues lyrics and lines like, My man left me, nobody to love me, shall I carve myself or that man that done me wrong? And in cabaret poems, me and my baby. This, of course, is appropriate to the feeling of the blues, as the blues are precisely about things that have been done to one, and it's precisely in relation to those feelings of being the object of someone else's or of the world's actions that the sense of plurality and collectivity that the blues records arises. Goodbye Christ performs a move analogous to the one made in the blues poems, from a singular subjectivity to a plural one. But here, that transition from singular to plural takes place by way of the me, capitalized me. At the moment of becoming a grammatical object, the speaker becomes plural and collective, a process which will then allow a new feeling of subjectivity and a new kind of agency to come into being. There's thus a pivot between the poem's representation of a new, represented and representing communist subject and the reception of the poem prefigured by the poem in that me. At this moment, the poem is the audience reading aloud in a common voice, as Hughes imagines or figures it. In this way, Hughes returns to the poetic and political problems raised by Johannesburg Minds, last paragraph, where the poem's avowal of its own powerlessness, its distance from absent workers, indicates by way of negation, this is Johannesburg Minds, indicates by way of negation the potential power of workers and readers who must both represent and be represented if the colonial exploitation of the workers is to be ended. In that poem, the potentially powerful collective, capable of consequentially reversing the subjection of African natives working in the mines, is clearly at a remove from the poem itself, indeed from poetics as such. But in Goodbye Christ, the audience collective and its potential power emerges from within the poem, which itself models a new voice, which it has given a new name: Marx, communist, Lenin, peasant, Stalin, worker, me. The poem thus prepares a representational site for the subaltern to speak by replacing the lyrical I with a collective me. As if to underscore the point, the poem compactly narrates and performs in this line, given its own stanza. As if to underscore the point, the poem compactly narrates and performs the replacement of the lyric I with the political me. I said, me. That's it. Thanks.
It's time for questions and comments.
Well, I'll make a couple of comments. First of all, I think that you're getting at the core of the politics of representation and use, and reading it against the political debates and theory is dead on, and it's almost canonical. It's like a matter of record. One place I think where a useful tension could be opened up and explored would be in the use of Spivak's use of Darstellung, and for Trayton, leaving out a term that's often juxtaposed with Darstellung, which is Vorstellung. And in one tradition, Darstellung has more of an emphasis of sensory presentation without cognitive framing. So the ideational content of representation is not so much the point, it's the sensory presentation of something. So then we might look at blackness or me in their sensory presentation as Darstellung. And then the question is, what form of representation does that comprise? And at that point, you point to the importance of the party formation, the importance of Lenin, categories like worker, and show the ways that sensory presentation is brought into a framework of representability in a cognitive sense, as opposed to a problem around materiality, which is dubious in terms of being able to be represented. So I would take the representational problem all the way to the question of materialism in the Communist Party, but also the views. And one stake for this would be to open up ways in which Hughes is negotiating representability between what's possible within the communist movement at specific moments in time, late 20s, early 30s, into the Popular Front period, versus what they don't quite get, what doesn't quite align with the way the party, let's say the party understood class up until the Scottsboro Boys, really. And that has some real consequences. So the Communist Party is advocating for a black Negro republic in the South. It's a very weird version of Stalinist national politics that's transposed. You mentioned the South African case and so forth. When you get to the Popular Front, which I think is probably the most of Hughes's recovered political poetry is written within that period. And that there's a way in which the hegemonic forces and the ways in which the Communist Party is making alliances with other progressive groups and national formations within the context of the late 30s into World War II, that becomes a ground for what he's doing, and that's much less Leninist than it is a movement away from the party itself. Okay, so then the representational questions would work differently. So I guess those are the two ends of the comment. One is this Darstellung and materialism question, and then on the other hand is the Popular Front and hegemony. And I think you can almost see hegemony in that list of names, right? Marx, Communist, Lenin, peasant. They're not identical, and yet they form a kind of discursive unity or something like that. So they become hegemonic, and then the me takes a value relationship to those.
Yeah, thanks, man. Great comments. Yeah, I mean to go back and expand this. I mean, as it is, I'm really just sort of focusing, obviously, on this sort of hinge between the 20s just into the 30s, right? So Goodbye Crisis 32. I mean, it's interesting how. But Johannesburg Mines is early. It's like 25. He's doing that right at the moment he's doing the blues poems. So I think the blues. I mean, the bulk of the paper as it's written now is focuses on Johannesburg Mines and the blues poems, which are sort of simultaneous with each other. And I'm sort of really, obviously I'm trying there to sort of formulate the sort of kernel of the problem that then seems to define Hughes's poetics from there on out as he's responding to different political situations. I mean, he sort of disavows, as famously, he disavows communism later. I mean, he sort of,
and it's not clear if he was ever a member of the party in that period.
It's not clear if he was ever a member of the party. He's a fellow. He says that he was not.
Yeah.
And maybe he, but I mean, Hughes had to make his living by being a writer, and he's whatever. He was sort of doing what he needed to do to get by. I'm more interested less in the sort of was he really, or the question of Hughes's particular sort of politics, and more in how he's clearly picking up a political problem and figuring out how to address it poetically.
Yeah. Just to bounce back a bit, I think you really nailed the early way he's thinking about that through the trope of the chiasmus. And so if you look at the Weary Blues, there's this alternation between subject and object being spoken for and speaking from, and that tracks. And I think that's even before his real communist period.
Yeah, right. I mean, then there's the poems in Spain. The Montage of a Dream Deferred is interesting. It's later, but it's also sort of interesting to think about in this trajectory. I mean, there's a whole series of things. Scottsboro Limited is sort of an interesting. I mean, that's where he's most explicitly hailing the party, but also figuring the way that the party represents as not as a speaking for, in a sense of representing, standing in for, but with this image of the flag, right? With like a flag, it will raise the troubles high, right? It's about sort of increased publicity. So that's a sort of interesting, and I think that's not what the commentary was saying or whatever, right? I mean, it's not that. So his tension with the sort of party line, I think, is consistent. He's just sort of taking what is is most compelling to him at these various moments. But I take your point, and thanks for it, about sensory presentation and materialism. Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
At one point earlier on, you were kind of soliciting comment in relation to the potential force represented by 240,000 Native workers. And it struck me that the way, like the language you were using and the way you were describing things was really close to the way Proust describes memory and that notion of the virtual, right? We're talking about potential forces trying to remediate the potentiality of a collective before that collective is even necessarily formed. And it struck me that your paper is like ramming into this line between representational and non-representational thinking. And what's really fascinating to me is through the poem you're trying to, or maybe Hughes is trying to represent virtual forces or precisely potential forces prior to their agglomeration and their actualization. So they exist as something that has the form of memory, right? It's real but not actual, ideal but not abstract. It has that form, but it isn't here yet. And that draws into its orbit, so much writing about diasporic memory, and I'm thinking particularly about Houston Baker's critical memory as coming out of theories of American race, and how there's this reaching out for a sense of memory that is never, it's not the coordinates of how white letters understand memory are inadequate to this project, right? So I just wanted to throw that on your plate because that limitation of representation seems really interesting and fascinating to me.
Yeah, great. I was thinking about the 240,000. I'm just sort of, I didn't get very far, but in thinking about the way that numerals represent as distinct from what is the tropology of numerical representation? If anyone has the key article on that, let me know. The Soviet early 20s, people are sort of interested, sort of factographers were kind of interested in this question about sort of math and poetics, but not quite on this. Mayakovsky has this famous poem, 150 Million, which he purports to be written from the point of view of all the Soviet citizens or whatever.
I was just going to say that. Do you think that Hughes was aware of Soviet factography? Because that seems to me like a typical factographic text. Because it's not just to document, but it's to intervene and transform.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Absolutely, that's what factography is, to intervene and transform, but no, I don't think so. I don't think Hughes knew, not at this point. He got interested in Mayakovsky later and translated some of Mayakovsky's poems, but that was in the 30s. His big interest in Russian stuff was at the beginning of the 30s, and so Johannes Romanes is 25. It's early. Du Bois didn't like, I don't know. Jessie Fawcett didn't like it. The editor of Crisis, she was like, it's too stark, man. But John, but your question about memory in relation to sort of numerical representation and sort of this question of potentiality is an interesting one. The way that I'm seeing, or anyway, the case that I make is that it's mostly by way of negation, right? That he's sort of figuring this potential. But yeah, that's a good thought about memory and potentiality things.
Is it about memory then, really? Because that's already in the past, right? The moment the poem is there, the number becomes a cipher, essentially, in its kind of self-denying kind of operation within the poem and the kind of chiasmus. What about, because I was really struck by the kind of transformation from the I into the me. It's like that, would you be able to kind of, I was thinking about Deleuze's notion of the people yet to come as a possibility of a non-representational mode of representation, paradoxically. Maybe, I'm not even sure whether it would be Darstellung or Vorstellung, but definitely something would be stellt. You know what I'm saying? So there's like this kind of the role of the poet or the artist as kind of to create a people yet to come, without usurping a place from the past, from within the past, or even within the present, to already define or delineate what that people might be, what the voice might be, and what the place or the position. So not a virtuality in a kind of like, potentiality, but really as the promise of art, as an activist, as a form of activist, and politics.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah, I mean, at this point, my sense so far is that Johannesburg, there's a shift from Johannesburg Vines to Goodbye Christ, right? I mean, he's sort of here. He's.
This is almost like a starting point or a spark. It feels like, right?
You know, it's like he's delineating what he thinks poetry cannot do.
Right.
But in dramatizing that point so negatively with this reversal, he's also sort of showing what needs to be done, or what could happen, or what might happen outside of the space of poetry. But then I think in the blues, the blues poems too, right? In the blues poems and in the communist poems from the early 30s, he's trying to turn the the way I'm thinking about it is in terms of like the party or whatever. But he's trying to think about the poem, how would the poem function like a party, doing this sort of representational work. And if I can part the question or the tension or the sort of is, what's the relationship between that kind of whatever, like Leninist representational work or the sort of representational work of the party? What does that have to do with a sort of Deleuzian people to come? I feel like Hughes's potentiality is it's not completely open-ended. It's not like, it's opposed to white supremacy.
Right.
And racial capitalism.
Yeah, it's also like they do it now, right?
Yeah, it's like there's a problem. Like it's fucked up. It's like he's like there's a problem in it. How exactly the collective that will fight back against that force is not sort of clear, but it's like in his Poetics he's trying to figure that out, trying to figure out ways to sort of bring that collective into awareness or into to allow its potentiality, to sort of allow its potentiality to happen. But it's, I don't know. I feel like the Deleuzian thing is more open-ended. Maybe. But thanks. It's a good thought.